I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Ellen Shaw-Smith is a board-certified neurofeedback provider and social worker with experience across a range of different therapy modalities in different settings, from high school counselling to community mental health and DBT groups, as well as 2 years of seminary study. This gives Ellen a deep and nuanced understanding of how trauma can impact the mind, the body, and the spirit. We've heard a lot during this conference about the importance of the therapeutic relationship and of attunement to our clients' needs. I know from having heard her speak about her work over the years that Ellen's work enacts these principles, and she has some really cool, insightful, practical and illuminating ways of describing how the mind, brain and neurofeedback work together. Ellen joins us today to share this aspect of her work. Welcome to ANSA, Ellen.
Thank you so much, Gillian. I'm inspired by that introduction. So and after these presentations, I couldn't be here last week and I unfortunately missed Ruth. So I came in with Heather and Claire and I'm just really blown away. So you've inspired me now to assume that surely I will have something of equal import at this late hour. I'm after 9 o'clock where I am, and so excited to be here. So thank you, Gillian. So let me see if I can pull my slides up here, hopefully. So I'm going to talk about the non-technical elements of neurofeedback. I'm not going to talk about psychotherapy per se as a non-technical element, which it is, but I'm going to talk about the non-technical elements of neurofeedback. And I have a couple reasons for thinking that this is an important topic. Excuse me. One is that when I was in graduate school, in one of my first practice classes, an instructor shocked all of us by saying, sorry, I've got a little voice issue going on, shocked all of us by saying that the only thing we have when we go into a room with a client is ourselves. And of course, as new students, we were hopelessly overwhelmed by that statement. But I found it to be true. And of course, now we have this neurofeedback system that does the most amazing things and can sometimes make it easy for us to forget the importance of bringing ourselves as fully and as authentically as we can. So I want to talk about psychoeducation, attuned psychoeducation, as one element of bringing ourselves to the neurofeedback journey. Let's see. So I'm going to skip to another screen and then come back to this one. This is one of the reasons that I decided that I wanted to present on this topic, because a few months ago, I was doing a webinar about neurofeedback tracking and modifying protocols. And there was a mom that was taking the webinar who had an 11-year-old daughter that she'd adopted from Ethiopia. And she lived in the Midwest. And it was a story that I've heard frequently over the years, that she had found a neurofeedback clinician for her daughter. And you know, they were doing treatment for some weeks, and it seemed to be that each week they came in and the very caring clinician would ask her daughter, how was your week and how have you been? And of course, she was trying to understand the effects of neurofeedback that they had done the week before. And I think we've all been in those shoes where we're hoping that our patient or our client is going to tell us something significant so that we can be sure that we're on the right track. And her daughter would simply say, as young adolescents do, she would say, I'm fine. You know, I'm fine. My week was fine. I'm fine. And the mother was quite discouraged and eventually discontinued the treatment because she didn't really understand what it was. She didn't understand how to make sure that it was improving things for her daughter. And it didn't make sense to her, and she just discontinued. So when she came to take my tracking and modifying webinar, and I asked her to share her story and some of the training that had been done so that we could look at it together as clinicians, you know, it was a story that I'd heard before, and I think I'd been part of the scenario early on in my own training. And then there was another story that came recently through another provider of a colleague of hers who went to learn some new technical neurofeedback skills that she felt were very important to learn. And she made the decision not to continue with the training because the group was being taught how to implement these neurofeedback training protocols, but they weren't being taught significantly how to track them and understand what the effects are and how to talk to people about those effects. So I can't perceive this as a random event. I have to perceive this as a field who's grappling between the how to value and spend time with both, the profound nature of having a neurofeedback system and the profound nature of using ourselves as educators and clinicians and therapists to help guide and align and integrate the effects of neurofeedback. So these stories are why I decided to work with this topic. And I made a decision to start with very briefly going through my own history of education and what's affected my neurofeedback practice most and the way I implement it and offer it to clients. Because I want you to all think about your own histories, and you'll see, in what I'm about to show after this, how it's reflective of my earlier history, my training, the things I've learned that I'd like to do and the things I don't bring to my practice. And I would just like to invite you to think about all the ways that you call your own training and your education, your expertise, your history, to bring yourself most authentically and fully into the conversation with your patients or your clients, so that you can really guide and create alliances with them and really get the optimal and the safest processes for them in the neurofeedback journey. So very briefly looking at my early training history, I got a bachelor's in psychology in a cognitively oriented program. I really appreciated some of the foundational elements of teaching the psychology that I learned, but I was not finding myself in alignment with the kind of pathologizing that seemed to also to be part of that view around people's dealing with their challenges or difficulties. So because of that mismatch, I decided to go into graduate school in social work, into a strengths-based program where I really learned how to help people become aware of their strengths and the strengths of others around them and the strengths of their environment, and use that awareness of strengths to help make changes, improve both their internal organization and the outcomes that they needed in their lives. But it didn't have a very strong clinical base to it. So I was still putting things together, but searching. And then 2 years of seminary helped me to understand a little better about people's internal processes in a non-clinical way. And then also my own trauma treatment, a history of early trauma and neglect, that I began my own treatment when I had young children, like so many parents do, and who decide they don't want to pass on the same kind of parenting that, they experienced. And, as many of us know, early on, that was, 40 years ago or so, we were mostly processing emotions or helping other people process emotions and events with very little awareness of the effects of trauma, or even identifying early trauma as something that was significant for people. And then after a while in my treatment, people began to talk about that, but there were still very few ways to remediate it. So my focus has always been on individuals within systems. And I worked in a high school and many years in outpatient mental health. And one of my most seminal experiences that I unexpectedly loved was being a DBT therapist and coach, and teacher. And I considered myself very lucky to work on a team for about a dozen years and to do what I called embodied teaching. And what was embodied about it is that those of us on the team asked ourselves to practice the same skills and values that we were teaching people, and also to follow some of the agreements that were very non-hierarchical. And one of my most favorite ones was the phenomenological agreement. And that was an agreement that when we were working with someone, we would put aside our expertise, our training, our judgments, our solutions that we thought, would be helpful to someone, that we would set them aside, and our initial and primary organization would be to enter into the reality of the person we were working with. And then we would bring all of our other areas of expertise to bear within that framework. So I think I was forever changed by that, even though I don't consider myself a behaviorist. But it really taught me something very humane and deep about my own, my own need to continue with my own evolution and the way I wanted to work with people around me. So group psychoeducation, individual application, and integration of the changes that I saw people making was very exciting and rewarding, but still it fell short of what people needed. So in 2002, I began to have my own neurofeedback training, and I went to my first intro course, and then with a focus on early trauma. Here I am, 20 years later, My influences have been Seaburn Fisher and Ed Hamlin. Ed helped me to become a teacher. Rob Coben, with his very particular way of working with the quantitative EEG for people with trauma. Our beloved Ruth Lanius and my own neurofeedback training is incredibly primary in the work I'm able to do with people. And I've been in education since about 2008. And I'm going through all of this quickly, but I want to encourage you all to think about all the elements of your life that you can bring to your communication. This is really about our communication with the people that we're working with. And I was very encouraged to hear Heather's, some of the phrases she was using and the conversation, because in a less technical orientation, my presentation, I'm talking about the very same thing of helping people really learn how to pay attention and notice the changes they're experiencing, to understand them and to communicate them to us so that we can be a team and make decisions together and come to the safest, most optimal outcomes with neurofeedback. So I hope my little perusal has given you an opportunity to reflect on things that you bring to this process that you might integrate in a responsible way with your patients that you might not have considered a strength that you could bring to the table. So I've already gone through my reasons for picking this topic. And so I want to just share a formal definition of psychoeducation. Psychoeducation gives information about an illness or a condition, along with ways to improve the functioning or symptoms of the condition. It also teaches effective ways to communicate about the condition. And I would say that communication is internal to the person themselves, that they begin to be able to think and understand their situation and communicate, within themselves in a way that makes sense, and to others, family members, providers, that might be able to help them. And so that communication is central to improvement. And neurofeedback itself is a kind of communication, isn't it? But we're talking about the more verbal, interpersonal realms of communication. And then lastly, psychoeducation has an assertiveness training element to it. And I unpack that in our domain as teaching people to act as agents of change on their own behalf, for themselves or for the needs of a loved one or family member or friend, that they really learn how to proactively use neurofeedback, track neurofeedback, be part of the process, communicate about it, understand it, integrate it on their own behalf as an agent of change, that they get to take claim for that. And these are the skills that we can teach people. And we can teach them this in many ways all through the course of treatment. So before I put this together, I did a questionnaire with my clients to see how they experience the psychoeducation that I provide them in the course of the treatment, the work that we do. And they weren't even, of course, cognizant of this word psychoeducation because they don't really present it that way. So I just simply told them that psychoeducation is information that I've offered to them to help them better understand physical, mental, or emotional challenges or experiences that they've shared with me as part of their neurofeedback journey and their psychotherapy journey with me. So I just want to identify, why I consider this a model of attuned neurofeedback psychoeducation. So what I want to say about that is that what's on the screen and what's in the review screen, the EEG that we watch, the changes that we're tracking, how we're talking to people about what we're seeing on the screen, everything that we're paying attention to and how we're modifying the protocols is crucial. But the client's changes from the neurofeedback, their ability to be aware of those changes and to speak to us about those changes is really the essential information. Because even if somebody's EEG changes and they may or may not experience changes around the EEG changes, but even if they actually are experiencing changes, but they're not cognizant of those changes, they can't integrate those changes, it's not really the standard of outcomes that we're seeking. So their changes and ability to be cognizant of them and to share them and communicate with them is really the essential information after training that we're looking for. And I consider psychoeducation an essential part of that process. So I'm sure that everyone here uses that in one way or another. I simply want to help you in a small way or a larger way to fill that out if there are some ways that you could bring psychoeducation to your practice in a little more robust way. And the way we're going to do that is look at 4 elements of 4 places in the process of being providers and guiding people through neurofeedback, 4 parts of that process where we want to be sure we're bringing psychoeducation. And the first is when you first take a call from someone or an email, or they come into your office and they want to understand what neurofeedback is and how it can help them. The next place is when we're going through the assessment, the neurofeedback assessment process with them. This is the starting point for teaching them about arousal. The arousal as a central part of neurofeedback, arousal as a basic and primary element of self-regulation in their nervous system. So assessment process is another primary place where we want to bring psychoeducation. And then furthering the shared alliance that we've begun to create in the assessment process when we're teaching them the tracking and modifying process, teaching them how to be aware of the changes in their body, the tension, whatever changes that they're able to track for us, and how they might help us with that feedback to modify the process so it gets the outcomes that we're all searching for. And then lastly, sometimes people do experience changes, but they're not registering those changes. They're not integrating them into a sense of themselves. So we're going to use psychoeducation to bring the thread, a thread to integrate the neurofeedback changes. So we're going to use psychoeducation in all these 4 elements. I can't see people anymore on the side of the screen. So could somebody just let me know that I'm actually being heard?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to ask that, but you guys have all disappeared and I don't mind as long as I know that you're there. So we're good. And you can see the slides okay?
Yes.
Excellent. All right, so then we're in the right place. So your very first opportunity is when you talk to someone the first time or they visit you the first time. And I'm going to use some very basic metaphors. This is not rocket science. Some people call us and they have a somewhat sophisticated understanding of neurofeedback. They may have done neurofeedback before. They may even be a provider who knows something about neurofeedback. So of course, we want to understand the basic understanding of who we're speaking with, what they come with. But I think the number one thing I want people to understand early on, and I just want to make sure they grasp a few basic things. I want them to understand that this is a different paradigm. And it's very important because it really slows down the process. If people are trying to integrate the new little pieces of things that they're learning into an old understanding of the nervous system, or trying to, remediate symptoms like they might think of for a medication, take an aspirin for a headache, or, if they're going to a provider for different specific physical changes they want, they have to, get surgery for something specific. People are used to thinking of themselves in a kind of compartmentalized way. So anyway, I want to help them understand very fully that this is a different paradigm. And in the very beginning, help them to have an open mind and help build a sense of excitement and hopefulness, with reasonable expectations that we're going to enter into this new paradigm together. So the way that I communicate about that is that we're going to work with the electrical communication system in their nervous system, in their brain, and their central nervous system, which is different from what most people are used to thinking about, which is kind of the chemical interface in their system when they're taking a medication, supplements, trying to eat well. That this electrical communication system is basic and fundamental, and that we now, for the first time, have a way to actually interface with this. And then a little bit at a time, they're going to come to understand what that even means. So I use some very basic metaphors sometimes, which one might be a ball team. And I talk about the brain as having areas of localized function that might be relevant to attention or mood or, sensory experience. And that we can, with this electrical communication and the way we can interface with it, we can help those localized functions to function better. And when someone is on a ball team, we also want all those team players, first baseman, first base woman, second base, third base, we want them to be able to play well with each other. because if they don't, then things don't go well. Even if they know their localized position well, the game doesn't go forward. And I'll also use the metaphor of what if half the team is in the dugout and we're playing, with less players than we need, so that they have some very rudimentary and basic analogy. I want this to be accessible to them. I want them to remember it. And I want them to kind of leave thinking about that they're going to do something very different than they've had a chance to be engaged in before. And this is often a metaphor, that we can kind of play with together. I also use a metaphor at times that regulating frequency is like a friend calling your brain. So everybody's probably had the experience, they're having a down day. Life is, you're feeling discouraged about something. And then the phone rings. Well, it used to ring. Now it's our cell phone. And you pick up the phone and it's a friend who's calling and you tell them your problem and they're sympathetic. And suddenly our mood has changed. The sun's come out. We're not feeling defeated anymore. And I talk about how actually our EEG may have changed in that moment, that we've had a stage shift, that something feels different from inside in a very organic way. And that working with our electrical system and with our frequency activity with neurofeedback is like having somebody call your brain and help your brain to make that change, that it's going to happen from the inside. I want to give people some little tidbit of a felt experience about what it is they might be entering into, so that they can begin to pay attention in the way that I want them to pay attention. I also let them know that many things change our frequencies without our awareness. If we have a good night's sleep or not, what we're eating, if we've had some fun, or if we're overworking, because I don't want them to think that just because they're being exposed to the idea of frequency for the first time, I want them to become quite clear that this is fundamental, has always been fundamental to their nervous system, and has been a functioning element of who they are and who they experience themselves in life the whole time they've been alive, that they just have never had a chance to be aware of it before. So I focus our conversation on the whole person, that if we're working to change some specific thing that they care about, that all of them is going to be affected by anything that we choose to do, and that it's not just symptom remediation that we're looking at, although that can be quite important. And also, as Seaburn would say, we do neurofeedback with or for people and not to or on them, because I want them to know that this is not like rebooting a computer. We're not actually working like that, and that's not what it means to work with neurofeedback with our nervous system. So I have a couple little stories as examples, and I just want to encourage you to have your own stories if you don't, or to think about all the different kind of rudimentary and basic ways that you can make sure from the very beginning that people are starting to click into what it is that you're hoping to offer them. Because as we go down the road with the neurofeedback process, we really want the most attuned alliance, the most informed client to be walking on that journey with us, so that we can get the best outcomes and take the very best care of them. So a couple stories that I have are that very early on, I did one of my first trainings and I was having a kind of a dark mood and some ruminating thoughts, and they shifted and they disappeared. And that was such a shocking experience for me. I really did not understand that anything like that could happen. And I remember saying to the clinician who was, doing my training, I remember saying, "What did you just do with my emotion?" Because I had no idea about the internal mechanisms that could cause a change like that. And since she was the only other person there, I held her responsible. And in some ways, of course, she was, but not, because it was my brain that made that change. And then another story that I'll sometimes tell people is that about the first 6 months when I first started doing neurofeedback all those decades ago, I remember this very special time when I would walk around almost every day and just look at people and think that I could never look at people in the same way again. And I would just have this continuous question almost no matter who I was interacting with. And I would have this question arise, and it would be, I wonder what it's like to be in that brain. And then I would interact with someone else or watch someone walking by me, and I would think, I wonder what it's like to be in that brain. And so this was kind of a sacred time for me where I think neurofeedback just completely flipped my whole sense of what it meant to be human. And I couldn't, despite all my training and my own, history and treatment and schooling, I could no longer see, people in the same way. So of course I use these stories discreetly in the right moments with people, but you may have more stories of your own experience, your own training, that you can use as these metaphors from the very beginning, because we really can help people attune and speed up the process and make it safer and smoother for people if we really create this alliance of understanding. So this is your first opportunity to do something like that. I'm going to talk then now about the assessment in the same way. And so looking at that, and I talked to my colleague Claire Goldberg before this because she does a lovely assessment webinar, and she was stressing, and I've added this because she's absolutely right, that when we're teaching, we're doing the assessment, we're teaching the language of arousal in the assessment. We're also teaching curiosity. So from the very beginning, we're not teaching judgment about the nervous system or judgment about the person and what they're, and they may feel that, an incredible self-consciousness at coming in and doing the assessment. But it really does change everything, as Claire said, to be teaching the language and the perspective of curiosity. So when I'm working on the assessment with people, I do share with them the 4 types of arousal that I know we may encounter. And I'm especially going to create some metaphors about those types of arousal that would match the kinds of things that they're sharing with me on their assessment that I know may become part of what we need to work with and we need to target. So again, in a very embodied way, I want them to have an understanding, to begin to be able to notice and track and have language for their own arousal patterns, and how that relates to the difficulties they're experiencing. I want this to become very accessible to them in a very basic, simple way. So we would talk some about over-arousal and what that might feel like, under-arousal, unstable arousal might be sort of like a snow globe that's always shaken up, or that game of telephone that people play where, in a circle, you'll start a communication going around the circle. And by the time it gets to the end, it doesn't sound anything like what it started out. So that people might understand that, oh, that's me. That's my arousal. It's not my character or my motivation. I'm not lazy or I'm not stupid. And they begin to understand very intimately what kind of arousal issues they might have. And then some people may know about the category of disorganized arousal, and then other clinicians, we might not talk about that. But, I want to help them understand that. And that can feel for people kind of like being in a rock tumbler all the time, that there's not quite any place to land. So I want to find some metaphors for the particular kinds of arousal that we're seeing in the assessment, and help them maybe come up with some metaphors of their own, and have a shared language that reduces shame and maybe brings some humor and some hopefulness into the situation. I have listed some of the areas on the arousal checklist because I have found sometimes that people are using an assessment that's not adequate. So for practical purposes, I'm just listing some of the elements you should have. And if you don't have these, you may have more than these, but if you don't, then certainly you can contact anybody from the conference, and they would help you get perhaps a more thorough assessment list. So we want to make sure we're looking at attention, cognition, pain, emotional and behavioral symptoms, neurological and motor symptoms, and immune and endocrine and autonomic conditions in the nervous system. And we also want to be asking about historical narrative kinds of questions, medical histories and medication histories, past and present, and lifestyle questions. So these are all the things that we can ask people. And in the realm of asking with curiosity, we are teaching them, as we're in that conversation right from the start, to see themselves differently, understand themselves differently, and join in this, very profound journey that we're about to engage in together. And it can become theirs right from the beginning in a way they may never have quite experienced before in working with a provider. And then lastly, looking at assessment, I'm going to come up with some concrete examples of things on their assessment that will help them understand arousal and look at themselves differently. So constipation is a good marker of high arousal, and I might, talk to them some about that so they could understand how that's related. And right there, if you talk about something like constipation, it gives them a cue that they can talk about sensitive things, things that they might feel self-conscious about, that we can make sense of those things, and that this is a place that it's safe to talk about all the elements of being human. Focusing issues is often a very useful thing to talk about with people, because many people come in with like ADHD diagnosis or talk about focusing issues. And because focusing issues problems with focusing can involve so many different kinds of arousal issues, it's a very good teaching tool to help people understand that one diagnosis, it does not mean the same thing for everybody, and that we don't even know what that diagnosis means for them, that we have to look more closely at their arousal patterns and what's going on with their EEG. And suddenly that diagnosis that they brought with them, that they may feel linked into in a kind of rigid way, that can open up, and they begin once again to see this new terrain that they're on in their work with us. And I just want to briefly share this example. It was very small to me at the time, but it's always fascinating and profound to watch some small piece of psychoeducation really change someone's life. So this is work with a client who experienced just years and years of ritual, intense abuse, every day as a child, and is a very functional adult, in the medical profession herself, incredibly humane, very conscious, lots of compensatory abilities, but she has had an urge to headbang since she was a young child. And she told me about it with great shame. And I just simply said, well, we tend to think about that as the body's attempt to see if it can change the EEG patterns or change the neurology in some way. And she just kind of froze when I shared what I thought was a fairly small piece of psychoeducation. And for 2 or 3, 4 weeks after that, she would just come in and sit down and look at me and just tell me how that one small piece of information changed her life. She was astonished that this urge that she had had for so many years, and that she had held in check because she was so determined not to do anything that would make her challenges worse, that somehow all these years, that urge that felt so wrong to her had always been a productive urge of her nervous system to try to right itself in some way. And those little moments accrued over time with people. They strengthen the understanding and the alliance. They strengthen the outcomes of the training and the therapy in ways that I don't think we can even imagine, and we tend to underestimate those. And she said that was like a life-changing bolt of lightning. So her shame and self-hatred went down with that. And then fairly quickly with training, that urge did disappear. So again, she found that the neurofeedback was consistent with our conversation and began to have a very different experience of that part of her history. So I realize I'm going at a fairly fast pace. I think we got behind in time a little bit. And I saw in the chat that someone was commenting on that the presentations were a little longer than they were expecting. So we've gone through using a few examples of the importance of using psychoeducation in early introduction to neurofeedback. We've also talked about it a bit in using it in very basic ways in the assessment process, and how important it is for people in ways that we might underestimate. And then I want to talk a little bit about the importance of using it when we're teaching people about how we're constructing protocols and what it means for them to learn to track the effects of the training and to record that tracking, because I do have tracking sheets that I ask people to use, and not everybody can do it that way, but I do use those. And the importance of doing that so that we can modify the neurofeedback to make the smoothest, most productive journey for people. So after we do assessment, we discuss the training priorities again, using the assessment and using arousal again as a primary focus. And then when I construct a protocol, I consider education and consent an ongoing thing with every single protocol, really every single time I train. And that kind of gets us out of that box where people still are going to have experiences that feel unexpected. And they may not remember that there had been conversation about, what was the neurofeedback that was going to be done or what the outcomes might be. But it makes a world of difference if you have had those conversations and if people have come along every step of the journey. So I'm always very explicit about where I put the protocol, especially the first time, where I put a sensor. And in ongoing ways, if we change it, I'm very explicit about why it's going in any particular location, what I hope to accomplish from that, what it might bring as far as I can understand it, with the knowledge that I can't predict that we need to listen to their nervous system to know if this is something that's going to be useful for them. I do the same around frequency, why I'm choosing a frequency, and what they might expect if the frequency is a little high or a little low. And of course, I do that in a way not to frighten them, but just to talk a little bit about, what it might feel like if they can't fall asleep as easily or if they feel lethargic and such. And so right then, they become more part of being able to track the effects right from the very start. And we talk about metaphors, about adjusting frequency. I'm aging myself when I talk about adjusting a radio because I'm not really sure that a lot of people I see now actually remember turning a dial on a radio. But there are different metaphors you can use. And so that they have a little bit of a sense of what we can call the bad news, good news, that if something about a frequency or a location doesn't give quite the effect we were hoping, that we can use that on their behalf to make changes so that we can get the outcomes that they're looking for. And when we've changed something that seems to have not gotten the effect that they wanted, and we've used that information and changed it in a way that was productive for them, they begin to trust the process. They begin to trust their body, and they begin to trust us and align with us, I think, in an even deeper way. So that education and that alignment, attunement, working together to make these decisions and changes it's so crucial. And it just makes such a more a safe and solid place to work from. Also, and again, I hear Seaburn in my head saying from now on, everything you experience is neurofeedback until we rule it out. And that it's going to be a few hours or a few days before we really know the outcome of any particular training that we've done. But that each and every time we're going to pay attention together and make sense of the outcome as best we can. And we're going to make modifications based on that. Also, the review sheets that I give to people always have spaces for them to create their own markers for change, so that whatever change is happening or not happening, it directly relates to their concerns. So I also remember a professor from graduate school saying, structure binds anxiety. And when you're working in a brand new paradigm that you don't understand, maybe under very uncomfortable conditions, if you've come in dealing with something that's really thrown your life, your, migraines or whatever might bring someone to us, to have structure around it, to make the process comprehensible, to help people feel control and that they have a voice. So tracking and teaching people tracking is a big part of that. And when I say structure binds anxiety, it's not just the client's or the patient's anxiety. I think it's ours as well, because we too sometimes can feel out on an edge, just really wanting to get the best results for people and not wanting to have the outcomes be too far afield from what we were hoping for. So this is an important area for using psychoeducation. Another important thing is to teach people that training one location always affects the whole brain, and that when we've trained, we're going to look at all areas of their functioning to notice what the effects are. So we're going to look at physiological changes, we're going to look at cognitive changes, psychological and emotional and behavioral changes, and changes in interpersonal experiences and behaviors. I also had spiritual changes down here, but I decided to take it out because, for some people that's a little outside the box. But I add that because sometimes people start feeling themselves not such an isolated being, and they start noticing that somehow they're part of something that feels larger, and they're not quite sure what that is, and they want to have a way to talk about that or notice that. But interpersonal experiences and behaviors is not always tracked also. For instance, if you're trying to help someone with their focus, you might not think to ask them how their interactions with people have been that week. But it's very important that people understand that any protocol we do affects all elements of the nervous system, or conceivably does. It doesn't always. So these are just areas of functioning that we track, and I put them under those categories of physiological, cognitive, psychological, interpersonal, and then a few under other. And so we can see that all the things that we might track to make sense of the effects of a protocol go under those different headings. And so I'll just leave you, the slides will be available later. If you want this, I'll leave you to look more at this particular slide. But, you know, we always want to notice if they have questions or concerns. And really, we want them to tell us if there's anything that seems different, even if it seems, as they would so often say, this must not have anything to do with neurofeedback. And lastly, I'm just going to give one of these examples because of our time, but we need to use psychoeducation to help people integrate the changes that they've experienced. So if I can say this briefly, it's very gratifying to have these integration conversations with people. And I have somebody, a gentleman who's a very functional person in the medical profession with a difficult trauma history, who is doing interhemispheric training, has very sensitive brain, isn't tolerating more than 3 minutes at a time, but very significant changes from his initial state of feeling quite paranoid and sleeping with a knife under his pillow, and not being able to ever tell if someone liked him or not, when in fact many people liked him. And so as we trained this simple protocol, C5 minus C6, 10 sessions, 3 minutes, he began to soften and be very different. Decreased sense of emotional isolation, decreased fear and sense of threat, began asking people, you know, to do things with him, just a softer, more person to be around with more enjoyment of others. And so, you know, we want to make sense of this. Like, we can just say, isn't that nice? The neurofeedback did that. But I shared with him a book called The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist, who talks about right and left hemisphere, the relationship between the two. And it's his belief that we as human beings, that it was intended for optimal functioning, that our right brain, that, you know, experiences life in a less linear, more direct way, that actually be our prominent orientation, and that the left brain, planning and analyzing and noticing for threat, that part of our brain be in service of the right brain. And it's McGilchrist's belief that that's gotten flipped around, and that the condition our world is struggling in is because of that flip. And that our goal or our need is to actually reorient that, so that we're not, again, living from a right brain orientation with the left brain in service of that. And of course, these are generalizations, but if you're interested in this, or it could be seen as a generalization, you're welcome to read. It's a lovely book, 600 pages. I only got halfway. But I began to talk to him about how this softening and his change of experience of interacting with people, not needing to sleep, you know, with this knife under his pillow, that perhaps his right and left brain were speaking differently to each other now and working together differently, because he'd been doing a protocol that would suggest that that might be exactly what had happened for him. And just that kind of integration conversation for people helps them own the changes in the neurofeedback process and really claim it as their own, and live with it, and, you know, maybe go on to work on something else, but really understand what it is that they've accomplished through working with the frequency activity in their brain. So I'm going to bypass these two, but these are just in service of time. But this is a little bit about what's in it for your client, to be so thorough in really making sure you're using psychoeducation. And then there's a slide, what's in it for you as a provider. And I have a list of things that might be interesting to you. And then I want to end with some parting thoughts from a client who's a semi-retired therapist. And these were her thoughts when I put out the questionnaire asking people their sense of the value of psychoeducation. And I really can't say it better than she said. So what she said that is, it has gradually sunk in that my state is a function of arousal levels. I have a history of depression and anxiety, as well as some difficult early family relationships. I was very used to seeing things from a psychoanalytic viewpoint, thinking I needed to work on something again and again. I've learned that I do have patterns, but they don't need all to be analyzed or gotten past. Rather, they need to be identified as high or low arousal with its many variations. This has changed my sense of self significantly to an understanding that state changes are not failures. They are indications of arousal changes. Slowly, I am learning to be a little more removed from my state, perceiving it with some equanimity, not being controlled by it. This has made my life much easier, and I appreciate it enormously. She also added, I guess the bit of advice I have for therapists, neurofeedback therapists, is that this is a very slow learning because it doesn't fit any of our paradigms for human behavior. And I promise you, I made the slide about paradigm change before I had read her contribution, but here she is speaking that, and the need to be slow and repetitious about the things that we're teaching in psychoeducation as part of this. So it doesn't fit any of our paradigms for human behavior. It means that people need to hear your message again and again. It's so easy to attribute state to particular events in life or interactions with other people, or to attribute them to ourselves as a depressed person or some other descriptor. It's important to keep giving the message again and again each time the person attributes their state to some internal quality of theirs or a particular provocation that has occurred. So last thoughts, clients and providers need to, all of us, we're continuing to learn what neurofeedback is and how it changes the body and the sense of self. These changes are best supported by an attuned process of neurofeedback and psychoeducation within a therapeutic surround. Changes from neurofeedback happen in all realms of the nervous system and express themselves in all elements of human life. Working with an attuned framework provides the safest and the most effective process for both the client and the provider. And I wanted to end with a quote from Seaburn. This was one of her first slides in a neurofeedback and psychotherapy course that she did some years back. The very first slide said, neurofeedback is a relational endeavor. And my quote would be that using neurofeedback technology in a relationally attuned manner makes being a neurofeedback provider a deep and sustaining privilege. And I feel very lucky to be in that position. So, and there will be an opportunity to go a little bit more deeply into psychoeducation in neurofeedback work. On December 2nd, there'll be a 2.5-hour webinar for anybody on a Saturday morning that's interested in furthering the conversation. So.
Thank you so much, Ellen. What you talked about today is something that all practitioners need to learn to incorporate very early in their working career. And for anyone newer to the field, I think this would have been extremely useful. And if anyone would like to attend that webinar,